November 1st, the day on which the Poles recall those who have departed. Over 6 million Polish citizens perished in World War II. 1 out of every 5 inhabitants of Poland. No other country had suffered so heavily in that war. Here, memory of those who had fallen fighting for independence never dies. Westerplatte. World War II started here at the break of dawn on September 1st, 1939. On his trip to Poland, US President George Bush did not fail to visit this historic spot. When the heaviest of shells from the battleship Schleswig-Holstein rained down on the 180 Polish defenders of this small outpost, the young George Bush had surely not expected that moment to have a personal bearing on his life as well. Millions of people, among them several 100,000 of the president's compatriots, lost their lives in the outcome of what commenced here at exactly 4:45 on the morning of September 1st, 1939. The defenders of this strip of land held out for 7 days, 1 day longer than Holland. When Hitler arrived in Gdańsk, the Polish soldiers were still fighting on Westerplatte. That day at dawn, over 2,000 German planes attacked Poland. They dropped their deadly cargo indiscriminately on military targets, schools, hospitals. Warsaw was bombed with particular ferocity. Fires raged in the castle, engulfing in flames priceless relics of Polish and world culture assembled here down the ages.
On the 1st of September, very early in the morning, I heard these dreadful noises, and I ran out of the building. And I saw the policeman on the place. It was a square in front of a church, and I said, "What is it?" He said, "I just heard on the radio that the Germans declared war on Poland and are entering in and are bombing Warsaw."
The main directions of the German panzer advance, the key target, Warsaw. The city was to have been taken on the 9th day of the war.
The 1st of September 1939, Hitler attacked Poland because Poland was the first country who said no to him. We were partitioned for 127 years. We were determined to fight for our independence, and compromise was impossible. So we had to fight. At the same time, we had the guarantee from Great Britain and France that 15 days after German attack against Poland, they will attack Germany from the west. And that was the Polish plan. That was the Polish plan, to fight against Germans as long as we can, waiting for the west from the help.
On September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. There was a universal conviction that the British and the French would very soon move against the Germans in the west.
On 17th of September, we get the information that the Russian tank crossed over our border, not far away from our defense, which we prepare against the German. After we were confronted with them, the order notified us not to shoot, but they come as friends. Disoriented, we put our weapon down and supposed to be interned.
Under the secret agreement with Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia occupied Vilnius and many other cities in Poland. As of September the 17th, Poland was forced to resist two invaders. The unexpected Soviet attack put into jeopardy the defense strategy of the Polish High Command. The second line of defense and the support troops received a blow in the back.
In September 1939, when the Second World War started in Poland, many people forget that Poland was attacked and invaded from two sides, both by the Germans and by the Soviets. And this double invasion had many consequences, both for people at the time and for the writing of history.
Warsaw is still fighting desperately. The Germans bring in heavy artillery. Aerial and land bombardment of towns and villages continues. Irritated that Warsaw is still refusing to give in, Hitler arrives to personally oversee the offensive. Poland and Warsaw were fighting, hoping that Britain and France would stand up to their Allied commitments and start military operations against the Germans.
We mobilized about 1 million soldiers. We had more. We had 1.5 million soldiers ready to fight, but we hadn't enough arms for them. We had only 400 planes and only one armored brigade against Germans. And of course, we had no chance to win that war.
Shortly before the war broke out, Hitler said in a speech to Wehrmacht officers, "The destruction of Poland is the primary task. The aim is not the arrival at a certain line, but the annihilation of living forces. Be merciless, be brutal. It is necessary to proceed with maximum severity. The war is to be a war of annihilation." These instructions were carried out meticulously. Encircled by the fast-advancing panzer troops of General Guderian, numerous Polish units were taken into captivity. With the Russians occupying large parts of eastern Poland, there was no possibility of forming a new line of defense. In such a situation, many Polish commanders had no choice but to surrender. All the more since the prospect of a second front in the west was fast diminishing. Bydgoszcz, the city close to the pre-war Polish-German border, was taken by the Germans in the first week of the invasion. It was one of the first to be subjected to Hitler's instructions to the Wehrmacht to act mercilessly. There were anti-aircraft battery emplacements here. On September the 10th, 1939, when people were leaving church after Mass, a German Hildegarda Reklau, whose grandfather was killed on the 3rd of September in the fighting with Polish troops because he was shooting at those Poles as a guerrilla fighter, came here bringing the Germans with her. She selected over 20 Poles and ordered the soldiers to shoot them as the Poles had executed her grandfather. Those Poles were taken to these emplacements and executed. A child died there also, so a total of 21 persons were shot.
Przy okazji zginęło małe dziecko, a więc w sumie 21 osób.
The first mass executions took place in Bydgoszcz on September the 10th, 1939. They followed the quelling by the Poles of a German uprising in the city on September the 3rd. This was just the beginning of a bloody Nazi rule in occupied Poland. Warsaw surrendered on the 28th day of the war. Jubilant Hitler reviewed his troops in the conquered city.
All Poles, we went to the war in hope, in expectation of victory. We counted that France and England, bound by the publicly announced guarantees, alliances, will help Poland militarily as soon as Germany invades Poland. We were wrong.
While battles still raged in eastern Poland, here in France all was quiet. General Jodl said later, in 1939 we were not prepared to wage a war against France, Britain and Poland simultaneously. We did not lose the war then only because 110 French and British divisions stood idly facing 23 German divisions. In Bydgoszcz, the terror continued. Upon her return home from Bydgoszcz, a British woman thus described the events in the city. The first victims of the campaign were a number of Boy Scouts from 12 to 16 years of age who were set up in the marketplace against a wall and shot. No reason was given. A devoted priest who rushed to administer the last sacrament was shot too. He received 5 wounds. A Pole said afterwards that the sight of those children lying dead was the most piteous of all the horrors he saw. That week, the murders continued. 34 of the leading tradespeople and merchants of the town were shot, and many other leading citizens. The square was surrounded by troops with machine guns. One of the first victims was a boy of 17, the only son of a well-known surgeon. We never heard of what the poor lad was accused. These are only a few examples of the indiscriminate murders which took place. The shooting was still going on when I left the town. Since the Nazis believed Bydgoszcz would be destroyed shortly, and the local intelligentsia was standing in the way of Germanization, they were killing the intelligentsia. There were 2 sites of mass murders near Bydgoszcz. One was the locality of Trzeszczyn, to the northwest of Bydgoszcz. The other symbol of such crimes was the so-called Valley of Death near Fordon, which is now a Bydgoszcz suburb.
Symbolem takim zbrodni stała się Dolina Śmierci pod miejscowością Fordon. Obecnie jest to dzielnica miasta.
Professor Leon Kaja był moim wychowawcą.
Professor Leon Kaja was my teacher at the State Teacher Training College in Bydgoszcz. He was murdered in the Valley of Death at Fordon. Professor Antoni Olejnik conducted drawing classes at the Nicholas Copernicus Secondary School in Bydgoszcz. He was also murdered at Fordon. Professor Medard Męczyński taught maths. He also died in the Fordon Valley.
Też zginął w Dolinie Śmierci w Fordonie.
In September and October 1939, the Wehrmacht was carrying out to the letter Hitler's directives of August 22nd before the invasion of Poland, to kill without mercy all men, women and children of Polish stock. Only in this way can we acquire the living space we need. In wars so far, the objective was to destroy the armies of the enemy, change its government, or subjugate it. This war was different. It had been declared on the entire Polish nation with the object of annihilating it and taking over a depopulated territory. Kraków, Poland's finest historic city, the nation's capital up to the middle of the 16th century. The Jagiellonian University, founded in the end 14th century, is one of the oldest in Europe. Collegium Maius, the oldest part of the campus. Among the university's celebrated students were the astronomer Nicholas Copernicus and the present Pope, John Paul II. Wawel Castle, the former seat of Polish monarchs. Governor Hans Frank, appointed by Hitler as the absolute ruler of the Generalgouvernement established on Polish territories not incorporated in the Reich, chose the castle for his residence. One of Hans Frank's first decrees was the order to shoot one man from each house on which a poster would appear marking November the 11th, the anniversary of Poland's regaining of independence in 1918. It was also on his orders that over 200 Jagiellonian University and Krakow Polytechnic professors were arrested and deported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Many of them never returned. Some of them were scholars of world renown. This action raised an outcry throughout Europe.
There was the day where we discussed in camp that the Warsaw gave up. I expressed to one of staff officer, he was colonel, said that we can wait now here, safety to the end of the war. He said to me, "You are naive." I didn't understand his statement. He said, "You don't know the Russian. I survived the Russian Revolution. You are young, 19 years, your duty is to escape. They kill you, they kill us the same way as the monk in the monastery of 1917, where the spots are here," and he showed with the finger. So I was lucky, I escaped. However, my brother, who was lieutenant in light cavalry, he stayed out. He didn't escape.
107 persons were shot on December 25th for the killing of a German in a restaurant by two local criminals. The restaurant owner was immediately hanged in the entrance. Józef Wasilewski was one of those sentenced to be shot.
Byłem 82 w tej piątej partii.
I was 82nd in that fifth party. The rest of my comrades remained when we left.
Ja poszedłem,
I went with Różycki.
chodziłem obok
Passing that coffee house where they killed those Germans, I saw the coffee house owner hanging in the doorway.
i zobaczyłem wisielca na właściciela kawiarni, który wisiał na drzwiach. No,
I knew then that this was the end for all of us.
koniec ze wszystkim.
My hair stood on end, so they say, but that's how I felt.
Człowiek jak strach, to dęba włosy stają, ale to jest tylko uczucie takie, ale faktycznie tak było. No, pogodziłem.
So what could I do?
Wyprowadzili
They took us
na
out
pole.
into a
Pana
field.
zostawili w szeregu.
They lined us up against a
pod
fence.
samym parkanem. Za nami stał
A soldier behind each of us with a machine gun.
tak zwanym rozpylaczem i tak nas ustawili. W pewnym momencie kazali.
And then came the order to kneel down, and that was when I fell.
że daje im
Like in the army, you know, hit the
Ja
ground.
już wtedy upadałem, robiłem takie wojskowe padnij i głowę.
I got my head as low as possible as I figured out that the shots would just scrape my back.
Ocalić głowę, a strzały pójdą do stycznej po plecach. Ale niestety nie.
I was a fraction too late, as I felt a light sting in my back.
No i upadłem. Po odzyskaniu przytomności.
When I came round, it dawned on me that they would shoot also the sixth group.
Szóstą grupę. No i w końcu dobiła się cisza,
Then it was all quiet, and they were gone.
a ja nie wiedziałem, co zrobić.
I didn't quite know what to do, whether to get up, call for help.
Jak
When the Germans left, I did not pass out. I moved my legs, they were okay. That's how it seemed to me. But then I became helpless. I didn't know what to do next. My head swelled. You can't imagine what it's like in a situation like that. You know, a man wants to live. The cemetery at Wawer in a Warsaw suburb. Among the graves of the victims of mass executions, 11 without crosses. They were Polish citizens of Jewish extraction. I was hit 4 times in the back. 2 of the bullets pierced my hand. One hit me in the head, here in the neck. It's there to this day. It makes me a bit uncomfortable. But the worst was the one fired to finish me off. The doctor said later I was extremely lucky. It stopped half a centimeter short of the brain. That was the most dangerous wound.
In discussing the war dead of Poland during the Second World War, it's important, I think, to make some basic distinctions. Of course, there was a major category of the victims of racial genocide. Something in the order of 5 to 6 million Jews were killed in Poland, about 3 million of them being Polish citizens. But there were other victims of genocide. The Nazis conducted a very vicious genocidal campaign against the Polish intelligentsia at the beginning of the war. And many people, of course, are not aware that the first wave of genocide in Poland was conducted, in fact, against Poles rather than against Jews.
The first large-scale street roundups in Warsaw started in May 1940. However, mass arrests were carried out even before that. It was rare for anyone imprisoned in the Pawiak jail in Warsaw to survive. The student Elżbieta Zachorska was shot for tearing down a German poster. The Polish intelligentsia was the main target of the wave of arrests which started in November 1939. The arrests embraced pre-war political leaders, lawyers, physicians. The action was codenamed AB, and its objective was to liquidate the Polish intelligentsia and people with leadership qualities. Irregular transports of Pawiak prisoners to an execution site in the woods of Palmyry outside Warsaw started on December the 7th, 1939. The trucks stopped on the verge of the woods and the prisoners were ordered to get off. Their hands were bound and they were blindfolded. Then they were led to a clearing and lined up along a newly dug trench. They were shot by a police or SS firing squad. Those who did not die instantly under the hail of machine gun fire were finished off with pistol shots. There are over 3,000 graves at this cemetery. The bodies of political activists, lawyers, university professors, teachers, physicians, and priests exhumed from the mass graves. 250 of the victims were Polish intellectuals of Jewish extraction. Among the graves, those of the Speaker of the Parliament, Maciej Rataj, and the Los Angeles Olympics 10,000 meters gold medalist Janusz Kusaczynski. Those who lie here are people who held a position of stature in Polish society.
Germans have a different policy in regard to Jews, where all Jews have to be exterminated, and to Poles, where not all Poles have been were planned to be killed, but only the elite. I myself read a announcement said, you Poles, you may leave when you will be free from your intelligentsia, your leading thing. And as a matter of fact, for instance, Auschwitz has been founded in order to destroy the Polish elite. I can give you a few figures. As long as priests are concerned, out of 10,000 priests which Poland had before the war, I got a list, personal list of 1,989 killed by the Germans, mostly in concentration camps.
The Nazis took such pictures of themselves in the desecrated Polish churches. Priests were classified as belonging to the intellectual elite and were persecuted with particular ferocity in the towns incorporated in the Reich. In Meller, for instance, over 47% of the priests were killed, in which 36%, and in Poznan 31%. Father Maximilian Kolbe was a missionary in Japan for many years. He offered himself to save the life of a fellow inmate at Auschwitz. He was entombed in a cell. When it was opened after 15 days, he was still alive. He was finished off with a phenol injection. 20 years ago, Father Maximilian Kolbe was beatified.
Well, I'm a historian of the Second World War and also a witness of things which happened at that time, because I took part in the campaign against Germans in 1939. Later on, I was underground in Poland, and finally I was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Auschwitz. So I know Auschwitz from the historical point of view and also from my own personal experience. Auschwitz was decided by the Germans, the place was decided by the Germans because of the central position. They expected already in 1939, 1940. First, the Auschwitz was built for Poles only. They wanted to terrorize Poles and to build a camp in which firstly the Poles will be kept and of course killed, murdered.
The Auschwitz site today. Tourists come here and photograph themselves at the infamous gate with the ironic words, "Through labor to freedom." On a fine summer day, this place looks neither terrifying nor ominous. There were barracks here, a place like many other. It was people professing the insane Nazi ideology who made Auschwitz a symbol of the greatest crime in human history. In early 1940, when Nazi prisons were overflowing with arrested Poles, the need arose to set up a concentration camp. Auschwitz was chosen. It was discovered here that Cyclone B gas, used as a pesticide, could just as well destroy people. The first experiments were carried out on Soviet POWs and Poles. They were successful. One of the most important tasks facing us in this tragic hour of history is to rebuild the Polish army. A Polish government in exile was formed in France under the leadership of General Władysław Sikorski. It included leaders of many pre-war political parties and groupings. Poland's first prime minister after 1918, Ignacy Paderewski, arrived from the United States, the famous pianist and a friend of President Wilson. The French campaign was short-lived. The Germans entered Paris and British troops had to be evacuated at Dunkirk. Polish divisions were among the first to cross the Channel. After the fall of France, every fighting man was of priceless value to the British.
The first Polish soldiers under British command were Polish airmen. And in the Battle of Britain, in August and in September 1940, when Hitler attacked Great Britain from the air, hoping that when he will win the war in the air, he will land on British soil, 151 Polish pilots took part in that battle, which there was the first battle Hitler lost. And the Poles managed to shoot down over 200 German aircraft.
Almost all the Polish warships and merchant vessels put into British ports. The British succeeded in ferrying to their shores most of the Polish pilots. Britain was now the only country resisting the military might of the Third Reich, and the Poles were its only military ally of sizable stature.
I was very happy to be again in 303 Kościuszko Squadron. That squadron had great tradition. It was organized 1919 in Poland by Cooper and Fauntleroy, very famous American flyers. And they were fighting from the beginning to the end of this war. And naturally, they were in Polish uniforms, and they got the rank of colonels. Airfield Nordholt was not very far from London, and we had excellent position. When we were in alarm and took off, we had time just to be on time in the air. Now, speaking about 303 Squadron, why we had such a score? At the end of the Battle of Britain, we had 126 confirmed. First of all, pilots of 303 Squadron, they were fighting Poland, France, England, and we had terrific training. And another thing, Polish fighters, even if it was the country of cavalry, when they took airplanes, they were again cavalry in the air by tradition.
1940. Great Britain is fighting for survival. The British people are gallantly bearing the hardships of war. Polish pilots are defending London. Polish merchant ships are carrying supplies to the British Isles, suffering heavy losses. Polish destroyers are escorting convoys. The mass street roundups, which started in May 1940, were also designed to procure slave labor for the Nazi Reich. On September 5, 1941, Nazi government advisor Retz reported to Governor Hans Frank that so far 1,400,000 persons had been deported to forced labor in Germany. The Generalgouvernement had a population of around 16 million. Its Lord and Master Hans Frank enjoyed being photographed with his family. This amiable middle-class gentleman in civilian clothes and in uniform on family album snapshots became a plain murderer. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed on his orders and under his decrees. He also kept a diary from which we shall quote.
Zwischen Polen zum Beispiel und Frankreich waren Unterschiede wie
The difference between Poland and France was like between heaven and earth.
Unterschieden, aber ungefähr wie zwischen Himmel und Erden. Das heißt,
in France, people sheltering Jews were not sentenced to death, only to prison terms in administrative court proceedings.
sondern einfach mit administrativen Mitteln ins Gefängnis gesteckt.
In Poland and the Ukraine, they faced the death penalty.
Ganz anders wurden sie mit dem Tode bestraft.
Hans Frank, interviewed by the correspondent V.B. Kreis on February the 6th, 1940. It would perhaps be interesting to define the difference between a protectorate and the Generalgouvernement. Let me explain it in practical terms. In Prague, for instance, large notices were put up informing that today 7 Czechs had been executed. I said to myself then, if I were to put up notices informing of the shooting of every 7 Poles, then timber in the Polish forests would not suffice for the paper needed. Yes, we had to apply a strong hand. The roundups and the mass executions continued. The terror intensified a hatred of the occupier.
With regard to the Jewish Holocaust, that is to the systematic genocide not only of the native Jews of Poland, but also of Jews from all over Europe that were brought into Poland to be killed after 1941, I think it's important to realize that the operation was conducted in stages. And these stages are not always properly presented. For example, they were omitted from the film Shoah by Landsman. The first stage of the operation, which began immediately after the Nazi occupation of Western Poland, was to separate the Jewish inhabitants of Poland from the non-Jewish population, to concentrate the Jews in ghettos, and then to seal the ghettos with high walls and barbed wire fences. As a result, before the Holocaust even began, the Christian and the Jewish population were separated from each other, and the possibility of mutual contact and mutual aid was virtually excluded from the start. And I think that is the necessary background before one discusses how much assistance may or may not have been given by the Christian population to the Jews in their great tragedy.
Separating the Jewish from the Polish populations was a major logistics operation. Jews inhabited hundreds of larger and smaller towns in the Generalgouvernement. At that time, no one was aware of the German objectives. Poles and Jews had lived together on these territories for hundreds of years. The Germans believed that by separating these two communities, it would be easier for them to effectively proceed with the extermination of the Jews. This proved to be indeed so.
Jews moved to Poland already in the 10th century of our era, but the large-scale Jewish settlement in Poland dated from the 16th century and was linked with the dominance within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the Szlachta. As the towns declined, so the Szlachta looked to the Jews to perform the functions which in other societies were performed by burghers, intermediary occupations, trading, handling the management of the Szlachta's estates. There was a special relationship between the Szlachta, which of course was the aristocracy in Poland, and which comprised about 10% of the society, and which really ran the society, created the elective monarchy, created the parliament, dominated all aspects of society. In this situation, the Jews were closely linked with the aristocracy, but they were also granted very far-reaching autonomy. The sort of autonomy which the Jews enjoyed in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth went far beyond anything achieved anywhere else in Europe. The desire for this sort of autonomy was a common feature of Jewish life in the diaspora. But in Poland, the extent of this autonomy was greater than elsewhere. The Jews in Poland had a parliament, the Va'ad Arba Artsot, or in Ashkenazi pronunciation, Va'ad Arba Artses, which effectively legislated for all aspects of Jewish life. The Jews flourished under these conditions. The classic Jewish settlement was a small town, called in Yiddish shtetl, which of course is a diminutive for town. These were towns in which the Jews constituted the majority of the population. They were effectively independent Jewish enclaves. Under these conditions, all sorts of Jewish cultural life flourished. At the end of the 18th century, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned, it probably contained within its borders more than half of all the Jews in the world. And this was an indication, I think, of the special role which Jews played here, and also of the special role which Poland played for Jews.
Up to end 1941, the Jews felt comparatively secure within the ghettos. Mass executions of Jews had not started yet. They only faced the death penalty for attempting to leave the ghetto. On the Aryan side, the situation was much worse. The Poles thought then that the intention of the Germans was to destroy the Jews economically, while the Aryan Polish population would be annihilated physically.
In
the summer of 1942, on 21st, 22nd July, the Nazis set down to the planned biological extermination of the Jews in Warsaw. In July, August, and the beginning of September, over 310,000 men, women and children were sent daily to, as it turned out later, Treblinka, to the gas chambers of this newly set up extermination center.
Obozów wyniszczenia, ośrodka wyniszczenia do komór gazowych.
In the concentration camps up to end 1941, the majority of the inmates were Poles. The chief architect of the extermination of the Jews, Heinrich Himmler, visiting the Auschwitz concentration camp. This was the ultimate factor behind the decision of a group of persons, including myself, to set up a committee for assistance to Jews. There were similar local initiatives in Kraków and Lvov. I'm speaking only about the Warsaw Initiative. Our committee was to render assistance to escapees from the ghetto, supply them with forged documents, place orphaned children or those entrusted into our care in various municipal or church orphanages, also to assist Jews materially. It was also extremely important to find hiding places for Jews seeking shelter. Initially, this was a small-scale action, embracing hundreds of persons, but after a few weeks, it expanded. In 1942, the Polish government in exile in London supported our action, and we set down to organizing the Council for Aid to Jews. At the same time, the Delegates Office of the Polish government in exile in London set up the special Jewish section in charge of these affairs, engaged in gathering information and charity.
Jews often reproach Poles for their behavior during the Second World War. It's a widely held view in Jewish circles that the Poles either actively participated in the Nazi extermination of the Jews or certainly looked with some sympathy on what was going on. Now, are these accusations accurate? I would say that they are not particularly accurate. In the first place, one point should be settled straight away. The reason that the Nazis established their extermination camps in Polish territory was not because they expected the Polish population to be particularly sympathetic. On the contrary, they counted on these concentration camps as a means of terrorizing the Polish population. Indeed, the largest of the extermination camps, Auschwitz, was actually in territory which had been annexed into Germany. The same was true of the first of the extermination camps, the camp at Chełmno. The reason why the camps were established in Poland was that this was an area far away from Western Europe, far away from the eyes of Western observers. It was the area where the bulk of the European Jewish population was to be found, and it was an area well served by a railway network, something which was crucial in the carrying out of the Nazis' extermination plans.
The location of the main death camps in the Generalgouvernement. Trains carrying human cargo arrived along these tracks daily. Here the arrivals disembarked and were put to death. Birkenau was a part of the Auschwitz complex. This was not a concentration camp. It was a factory for killing people. In the winter of 1942-43 and in 1943 and 44, we were gathering documents of Nazi crimes against the Jews not only in Warsaw. They prepared the memorials. We enclosed the documents and sent the material to London. One of the first transports of documents compiled in the early stage of the newly formed Jewish section was that taken by Jan Karski. He arrived in London in November 1942.
Jan Karski tells a story about when he was in America and he met Felix Frankfurter. And he was introduced to Chief Justice Frankfurter by the Polish ambassador, Czechanovsky. And Czechanovsky, after Karski told the story, Frankfurter turned to Czechanovsky, who was an old friend of his, and said, I can't believe this young man. So Czechanovsky said, are you calling him a liar, Felix? This is a friend of mine. This is somebody I would vouch for. He said, I'm not calling him a liar. I'm just saying I cannot believe him. I think that what we have to remember about the Nazi mass murder of the Jews was it was totally inconceivable. Nobody could have envisaged that something like this would happen.
From the diary of Hans Frank under the date October 18th, 1941. Jews are for us a particularly harmful, gluttonous lot. Estimates put the number of Jews in the Generalgouvernement at 2.5 million. Together with those related to them in one way or another, the Jewish community numbers 3.5 million. We cannot poison them, but we shall have to take steps leading in the end result to their destruction.
W getcie broni praktycznie nie było.
There were no arms in the ghetto, really, but there were combat organizations, training people in the theory of combat, set up as early mid-1941. They had a pretty large membership. At that time, the Holocaust issue had not been brought up. It was a question of putting up resistance.
Sprawa zagłady właściwie wyszła dopiero pod koniec 1941 roku po Bełżcu.
The Holocaust issue did not arise until end 1941, after Bełżec, and it was only then that these organizations changed in character. From Hans Frank's diary. Today, 2,405 cases of typhus have been reported in the ghetto. In reality, the figure is certainly much higher. In Warsaw, 503 cases have been registered among the Poles, and in the Starost districts, 589. The confining of Jews to the ghetto is a blessing. It is important that it be sealed tight. Welcomed was the order of the police chief to shoot at Jews on village roads.
In Claude Lanzmann's film, Shoah, Lanzmann paints a picture of three groups in relation to the mass murder of the Jews: the murderers, the bystanders, and the murdered. And he paints a picture of the bystanders watching, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with some degree of hostility to the events which was taking place. I think that this categorization is also a grave oversimplification. What one has to remember about conditions in wartime Poland was that there was a very acute and savage terror prevailing. The Nazis had introduced the death penalty for hiding Jews, and indeed, on occasion, they used this death penalty. It was not a situation in which the bystanders had a free choice. The bystanders themselves were under considerable pressure, as were, of course, many of the Jews. Lanzmann interviews people who were in the Sonderkommandos, that is, people who were responsible for burning the bodies of Jews gassed in the gas chambers. They also had little choice about whether to do this or not. This was a situation in which a free choice didn't really exist.
Around 6,000 Jews were sent from the Warsaw ghetto daily to the extermination camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Bełżec. The ghetto population dwindled significantly. By end March 1943, it dropped to 70,000 from the initial figure of close on 500,000. Someone took a picture of the group of children in the care of the well-known pedagogue Janusz Korczak being driven from the ghetto on their last journey.
Decyzja oczywiście jak zawsze
Of course, as always, when it comes to starting armed struggle, the choice is not easy. It is necessary to remember that even for such a large force as the Home Army, the decision when to start the Warsaw Uprising was not an easy one. So it is small wonder that in the case of a small group of people with very little arms, such a decision took time. In fact, when we speak about an uprising, we have to define what that really means. An uprising is when something is planned, that we start on this day, assume power, and so on and so forth. Here, such a possibility did not exist. Here we can speak only of defending something, some ideals, some cause. But since there was a war, in a war, you do not use words, but deeds. So it was necessary to undertake that defense in the Warsaw Ghetto. That was the first major defensive action. The task of the council was not to organize uprisings, nor to supply weapons. These matters were arranged in contacts between the Home Army and the Jewish underground. The Jewish underground, even though small in number but determined, wanted as much weapons as possible. But the Home Army, which in 1942 and 43 was also ill-equipped, was not keen on supplying arms. No soldier eagerly parts with his weapons. But the Home Army did supply weapons, dozens of pistols and rifles. The demand was for more. It gave grenades. Arms could not rescue millions or even thousands of Jewish lives. Arms could only help the Jews to die fighting. That was all. No human life has yet been saved by shooting. The problem was a different one. It was the issue of the posture of certain young, idealistically minded young people who said, "We shall not die standing. We want to fight." The number of guns is not the decisive factor. If there were 150 or 200 more guns or 150 more grenades, the outcome of the uprising would have been the same, and it would not have saved anybody. There was no chance of survival. It was a great political act and nothing more. Just choosing how to die.
To był właściwie poza tym, był to wybór sposobu umierania.
On February 16th, Himmler issued a secret order to proceed with the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. On the night of April 17th, it was surrounded by an army and police cordon. The insurgents were prepared for this action. 850 soldiers and 16 officers entered the ghetto through the main gate on April the 19th. They were greeted with grenades and gunfire. Taken by surprise, the Germans lost 12 dead. In these circumstances, they adopted a different tactic, moving from house to house, crushing the resistance. On May 8th, encircled by the Germans, almost all the uprising leaders committed suicide in their bunker. Among them, the uprising commander Mordechai Anielewicz. Anielewicz's deputy, Marek Edelman, was then in another section of the ghetto, and he fought on for many more days. It was not until May 16th, 1943, that the Germans declared the ghetto as having been finally conquered. Of the 56,056 Jews left alive, 7,000 were shot on the spot. The remainder were sent to either extermination centers or concentration camps. To me, the thing that really mattered was saving people, saving the lives of women, children, the aged and the weak, those who were the most helpless, and that was an extremely difficult problem. Of course, we can never save a whole group of people who comprise 30 to 40% of the total population of the city. You can save only individuals. Did the Poles do enough in this respect?
The reaction of Poles to the mass murder of the Jews was, in my view, not dissimilar to the reaction which was found everywhere in Europe. A minority of the society actively sympathized with the Jews and took great risks in order to hide them, to help them, and to protect them against the Germans. Teresa Prekharova once said that it took up to 10 people to hide a Jew, but only one person to betray 50 Jews. So the difficulties of hiding were great. Nevertheless, a substantial number of Jews were hidden. A third of the trees in the Avenue of the Righteous in Jerusalem bear Polish names. We don't know for sure how many Jews were hidden by Poles during the war. I would say that the figure is probably between 25 and 30,000. The number of Jews who survived in occupied Poland is probably around 40 to 50,000. But these figures are not as important as the enormous sacrifices which individuals, and very noble individuals, made to hide Jews. The majority of the population living under Nazi terror in conditions of great difficulty, conditions of terror which it's almost impossible for Americans to understand, reacted as people do under these conditions. They retreated into themselves. They tried to find the easiest way out. They had some sympathy for what was going on, or perhaps more or less sympathy, but they were unable and felt themselves unable to do anything. A small minority helped the Germans or participated in the mass murder of the Jews, either out of conviction, which was rather rare, or more usually out of the usual motives of blackmail and the desire to take advantage of those weaker than themselves. It's often held that the Dutch are a particularly philo-Semitic people and have a very good record on hiding or helping Jews during the war. And yet 90% of the Jews of Holland were murdered during the Second World War. It was the conditions under which the Jews lived which made this possible. In Poland, the Jews, with some few exceptions, were clearly distinct from the rest of the population. They were distinct in appearance, they were distinct in the language that they spoke, they were immediately recognizable. I've done quite a lot of work on people who've survived. I've edited a number of books by people who've survived. There is no doubt that the more Polonized you were, the better you could speak Polish, the more Polish your appearance, the more likely you were to survive.
The phenomenon of collaboration in Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War is a complex one. The media tended, especially in the United States and in Europe, in some European countries, tended to concentrate for a variety of reasons, very often Soviet-inspired, on various manifestations of collaboration, mainly in Eastern Europe, in East European countries, neglecting the phenomenon of collaboration in Western Europe, and forgetting the extent and gravity of that collaboration. For example, between 1940 and 1944, French citizens, mainly inhabitants of Paris, had sent to the German authorities more than 3 million letters of denunciation, very often with accurate addresses and with other vital information. Secondly, the French police, it's generally known now that the French police has often shown on many occasions an extraordinary zeal in rounding up the Jews and deporting them. For example, on one occasion, the French police, heavily armed, about 9,000 of members of French militia, without any German supervision, rounded up 10,000 Jews in the ghetto, prepared them for deportations. Furthermore, in a statement made in 1971, the eminent French biologist Dr. Claude Lévy has this to say, for example, and I quote, "France collaborated. It is the only European country which collaborated. The others signed armistices or capitulated. This is the only country in Europe which had government which adopted laws which on a racialist level went even further than the Nuremberg laws, since the French racialist criteria were even more strict than the Germans."
A
Alongside the extermination of the Jews, street roundups of the Polish population continued. Transports were directed to Auschwitz. Around 300,000 Poles died there. Up to 1942, Poles were also in the majority among inmates of many other concentration camps: Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen. We should not forget that in those terrible years, some 3 million Polish Christians died on Polish soil alongside the close on 3 million Polish Jews. That in Auschwitz alone, which is the symbol of the Holocaust, which I fully accept and understand, apart from the millions of Jews, also some 300,000 Polish Christians perished. After all, for their families, this is also a site of remembrance. One should not forget that the penalty in Poland, not in Holland, not in France, for helping Jews was death. Not arrest, not a fine, not deportation to a camp, but death on the spot. So that too had a bearing on the behavior of people. After all, not many people are prepared to sacrifice their life to save the lives of strangers, sometimes not even the lives of family members. I would say that there is a far-reaching understanding of this situation precisely in Jerusalem. There in 1962 they founded the Avenue of the Righteous Among Nations, and there you have trees devoted to the memory of people who came to the assistance of Jews, risking their own lives in Nazi-occupied Europe. Among those trees, of which there are now over 6,000, some 2,000 bear Polish names. That means that objective historic Jewish sources have proved that at least 2,000 Poles had risked their lives to save Jews. I would not say that this is a small number. In biblical Sodoma, the Lord had demanded 10 righteous to save the city. In this fine Renaissance town hall on the 17th of July 1941, the Reich Security Minister Himmler met with SS and Police Chief Attila Globotnik. Their decisions were crucial and tragic in consequence for this region. Himmler was offered this beautiful Renaissance town, and it was given the name of Himmlerstadt. Later it was changed to Fluchtstadt, the town of the German plough in the east. The second, more important decision was to make the entire Zamość region the first German settlement area in the east. Later it was called Sonderlaboratorium SS Bollwerk, the German fortress in the east. This was basically connected with the so-called Generalplan Ost, a General Plan East, which provided for a major manipulation after the victorious war in the East, in reality the extermination of 35 million Slavs within 15 years. The village of Sochy lies in the Zamość region of southeastern Poland, a region which was to have been Germanized to create a bulwark containing the Slav element in the east. A deportation action followed under General Plan Ost of the Reichsführer SS. It was accompanied by mass executions and punitive operations. The methods were extremely brutal. The villages were cordoned off, put to the torch, and the people murdered. Another method was destruction from the air. Artillery was also used in this punitive operation, and people were burnt alive. We are now in the village of Sochy. This village was raided from the air. 183 villagers died then, including women and children. The village was burned down completely. The village of Sharajówka. Here no life was spared. On the tombstone, the dates of birth and death are identical. Here all the villagers were driven into a barn, the gates propped up with heavy poles, and the farm buildings set on fire. Sharayuvka was not the only village where such actions were carried out. At Kitov, 3 times as many men, women and children were burnt alive. All in all, 120 villages were put to the torch in the Zamość region. Large areas of this rich farming region were depopulated.
Byłem w Modryńcu, w dworze I dowiedziałem się.
I was at the manor house in Modreniec then. I heard that my children had been burnt, so I came to look for them. I found only the bones of my children. One had been burned sitting in one corner, the other in another corner. The youngest had been burnt lying under its mother. Here on my knees, I gathered the remains and kissed them. 3 kids. The eldest daughter was 12, the youngest kid 5. God forbid such a tragedy. I would have preferred to die with them. Those who were not killed on the spot were deported to a transit center in Zamość. It was sited in a 19th century stronghold. Here further selections were carried out. Some of the victims were shot and their bodies burnt in the courtyard. The lucky ones were directed to concentration camps such as Majdanek or Auschwitz. These pictures were taken shortly after the liberation of Zamość. Charred bodies lay in the center of the courtyard. The plight of children in the Zamość region is one of the most tragic episodes of the war. At the start of the Zamość operation, the Germans had compulsorily removed children from their parents. Children were subjected to racial examinations. They were measured, weighed, but their fate depended basically on anthropological measurements of the head. If they matched the German race norms, they were classified as suitable for Germanization. Those children were then sent to special Germanization camps to be brought up as Germans, basically, though, to replenish the depleted ranks of the armed forces. In the camps, discipline was very strict. Prussian drill was the basis of the German education process. The deportation of children enraged the Polish population. From Hans Frank's diary, deportations in the Zamość region aroused deep anxiety. The sending of children to Warsaw played a certain part in this respect. Originally conducted on a small scale, this deportation action has now proved to be very disturbing. Some 30,000 children were embraced by this deportation operation. Those which did not pass the anthropological tests were sent to Auschwitz. There they would die either of hunger or a phenol injection into the heart. A Polish army was being formed in the Soviet Union under an agreement between the Polish government in exile in London and Stalin. The Poles arrived at the assembly centers often straight from the POW camps and the gulags. General Anders was appointed its commander. It was composed of Poles who had found themselves within the Russian occupation zone after September the 17th, 1939. Women and children arrived here also. Many of the arrivals were in a pitiful state. Some 3,000 persons died here of exhaustion within the first 2.5 months. The Soviet camps were no different from the German concentration camps. General Anders will lead his men out of Russia to Iraq. There they will receive British weapons. Their many months-long trek to Iraq claimed fresh victims. Finally, he reached his destination with 60,000 men. In North Africa, the Polish Highland Brigade had been defending Tobruk in 1941. The Poles comprised 10% of the fighting force the British had in that theater of war.
Then came British-Soviet alliance, concluded May 26, 1942. Through the negotiations, Stalin insisted there must be secret clause in which Great Britain will recognize that the Soviet Union will retain all territories which it acquired through cooperation with Nazi Germany. Churchill agreed with the insertions of the secret protocol. It was not done, however. At the time, the United States opposed, and American Secretary of State Cordell Hull protested against it. America won.
Meanwhile, in the occupied country, units of the underground Home Army and the peasant battalions were effectively harassing the military machine of the occupier. The main target of the attacks were trains carrying men and equipment to the Eastern Front. Between 1941 and 44, the Polish underground destroyed or damaged 6,930 locomotives, 19,000 rail wagons, 4,326 military vehicles, and blew up 732 trains. This was a major help to the Russians.
One has to remember that Russia had been the ally of Britain and France and the United States in the First World War, and the same traditional alliance was always in prospect during the Second World War. The main concern of the British and French at the beginning, before the entry of the Americans, was to contain Germany and to ensure that they were able to sustain a long war of 4 and 5 years. In that context, the fate of Poland was, unfortunately, a rather secondary issue.
A 60,000-strong corps commanded by General Anders lands in Italy and advances on Monte Cassino.
But Stalin, after the first shock, because he was losing the war against Hitler, after the first shock, when he managed to defend Moscow, he changed his mind about Poland, and this army was evacuated to the Middle East and reorganized for the Second Polish Corps, which finally landed in Italy and captured Monte Cassino, one of the most important battles in Italy, because the road to Rome was open thanks to the Polish victory there. In the Polish Second Corps, there were about 50,000 Polish soldiers.
This German fortress had been unsuccessfully stormed by the Americans, the British, Australians. The Poles captured it on the second attempt. The Germans were forced to withdraw. The price paid by the Poles for that victory was over 1,000 dead.
Stalin zmienił swoją koncepcję w stosunku do sprawy.
Stalin changed his concept of resolving the Polish issue already in 1942. that is, after stopping the German advance at Stalingrad and Leningrad. He grasped then that he can have on his borders not only a friendly and independent state, but also a vassal state. He decided to suspend, or rather sever, relations with the government in London and establish in its place a new government, or perhaps a committee, which he would control. The discovery by the Germans in April 1943 of the mass graves of Polish officers at Katyń had shocked Polish public opinion.
Later, as I was in prison camp, we were notified that the German discovered the grave of Polish officers in Katyń, close to Kozielsko. My cousin, medical doctor, he was member of Red Cross to identify the remaining from officers in Katyń. He found also remaining of my brother Kazimierz Wyrobek, the lieutenant of light cavalry. He found by him letter from home and documents identified his person. This old paper my cousin brought back to Krakow and gave to his wife. What later, she still afraid to have such document, she destroyed them.
90% of these officers were reservists, physicians, university professors, scientific workers, lawyers, journalists, artists. The AB action of destroying the Polish intelligentsia had been executed simultaneously by both occupiers, the Germans and the Russians. As Stalin decided to suspend and then to sever relations with the Sikorsky government, the last straw was the Katyń issue, even though General Sikorsky displayed moderation and tried not to toe the German propaganda line. Of course, for Stalin, that was just a pretext to finally break off relations with the Polish government in exile in London.
I remember vividly the Katyń affair. At that time, I was still secretly in London, still reporting to variety of organizations, intelligence organizations, psychological warfare. It was April 1943. Once the Katyń affair burst out publicly. This was a subject of almost every conversation I had with both Americans and the British. I didn't meet one single individual who had any doubts on the subject. It was the Soviet government who committed the crime. And I didn't meet any single American or British official who would not state at this time Soviet Union should not be accused of this crime. This would be interpreted by Stalin as our support for the Nazi propagandists. The attitude of the Polish government putting in doubt Stalin's goodwill complicates our relations with the Soviet Union. You Poles, you are wrong bringing this matter severe consequences will result. Argument that you are cooperating, believing the Nazi propaganda.
We know that in 1943, the British government was clearly informed that the massacre of the Polish officers at Katyn was a Soviet crime, that it had been committed by Stalin's secret police, and yet in the interests of Allied unity, the British government put out exactly the opposite of what they knew. That the massacre was blamed on the Nazis, and to this day the British Foreign Office wants to maintain that the matter is unclear.
When I came to the United States at the end of June 1943, again I started to report to a variety of government leaders, civil leaders, prominent political commentators, still secretly. I was still supposed to go back to Poland. Many people asked me, what about the Katyn affair? To everybody I was saying, I have no slightest doubt. The Soviet authorities committed this crime. This time, Germans are saying the truth. And I remember specifically, at a certain time, employee, I remember his name, but I will not say his name, came to the Polish embassy, had a conference with Ambassador Ciechanowski and me, saying, Mr. Karski, we do not wish you to accuse the Soviet Union of Katyn murder. This is contrary to our strategy in this war. Soviet Union is our precious ally. You keep your mouth shut. Don't speak about the Katyn affair. And I did not speak about the Katyn affair in my secret mission in July, August 1943. I was forbidden to do it. I was a courier. I was not a negotiator. I was doing what the authorities ordered me to do. Ambassador Ciechanowski agreed with it. Don't complicate our situation here. Don't antagonize American authorities.
The Union of Polish Patriots was an organization composed chiefly of Polish communists totally faithful to Stalin. Under its auspices, a new Polish army was formed. Over 2 million Poles had been deported deep into the Soviet Union towards the end of 1939 and at the beginning of 1940. This army was for many the only hope of returning from Siberia or leaving the gulags. So the deported Poles joined its ranks in large numbers.
27 kwietnia odbyła się rozmowa.
On 27th April, General Berling, Alfred Lampe, Wanda Wasilewska and I met with Stalin, and he told us that it has already been decided to form the 1st Division and the 1st Army in Russia. Also to call the Congress of the Union of Polish Patriots and to adopt the platform of an independent, sovereign Poland, but the People's Poland. Perhaps not socialist, as that was not the term used then, but a democratic Poland tied up to the Soviet Union. That was the decision that determined the status of Poland as a Soviet vassal. Meanwhile, at home, the resistance movement under the orders of the Polish government in London developed into a powerful military force. This underground army controlled large parts of the country. Apart from conducting subversive operations, the Home Army had an excellently organized intelligence wing which supplied valuable information to the Western Allies, mainly concerning the structure and strength of German forces in Central Europe.
Then came 1943, in a secret conference in Washington between Eden and President Roosevelt. Both statesmen between themselves agreed that after the war, the Baltic states will form a part of the Soviet Union. Polish eastern boundaries will be Kherson Line, with possible changes in behalf of Poland. Romania was not treated. Romania at the time was allied with the Axis power, with Nazi Germany. Then came a conference of the foreign ministers, Eden, Kordelhal, and Molotov in London, October 1943. Molotov proposed the countries which will be liberated by Great Britain and the United States, both those governments will carry such policies which will be in their interest. The Soviet Union will not interfere. As far as the territories liberated by the Red Army are concerned, Great Britain and the United States will not interfere. The Soviet Union will be guided by what, as Molotov stated, by their own raison d'etat. This proposition was silently approved by both Great Britain and the United States.
In Italy, General Anders' 60,000-strong corps resumes the fight, having received fresh equipment supplies. The battle trail leads north along the shores of the Adriatic. The Poles are fighting gallantly, believing that they are waging the fight for a free and independent Poland. They are not aware yet that their country and its future are but an element of the cynical game of big power politics.
Then came Tehran Conference, November until 1st of December 1943. In the last conference between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, 2 hours before the conference started, the president sent a message to Stalin. He wants to see the marshal in his quarters. Roosevelt could not walk. He was crippled. Immediately, Stalin came. About that conference, even Churchill was not informed. During the conference, the president stated, he agrees with Stalin's attitude and policy towards Poland. However, he does not want to take part in discussion, which was to take place in 1-2 hours later. He does not want to be on record about his attitude. Next year, presidential elections are going to take place. He decided to run for the 4th time for the office of the President of the United States. He has in the United States 7 million Americans of Polish descent. He needs their votes. He will reveal his attitude only after the elections. Stalin answered that he understands.
Soviet troops cross into Poland. A white-flung operation pushed the Germans right up to the line of the Vistula. The Red Army and the pro-communist Polish troops enter Lublin. This is what they found at the castle. Hours before fleeing, the Germans killed the prisoners held there. 3 days later, the Soviet secret police installed itself there. Its first prisoners and victims were Russia's allies, the Polish Home Army resistance movement fighters. The German occupation is over. In liberated Lublin, people joyously celebrate the arrival of freedom. but very few in this jubilant crowd are aware that the Polish state stands no chance of being revived in its pre-war shape, and that its future had been already decided by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin.
W obliczu wejścia armii radzieckiej do
As the
Polski,
Red Army was soon to cross into Nazi-occupied Poland in the spring of 1944, Stalin had to make up his mind about the composition of the future Polish government. The Warsaw Uprising broke out on August 1st, 1944 at 5 p.m. Only 2,500 of the over 28,000 insurgents are sufficiently well armed. A victory of the insurgent army subordinated to the Polish government in London would have created the prospect of restoring a democratic government in Poland, and that was the idea behind the uprising decision.
Ocena akcji powstania warszawskiego.
In my view, the military concept of the Warsaw Uprising, which broke out on 1st August, did not augur hope of success.
Według mojego zdania nie rokowała sukcesów. Mogliśmy przecież stawić.
While we could counter the Germans with fairly large home army forces, nevertheless the men were short of weapons and particularly ammunition.
Armii Krajowej były one jednak pozbawione broni, a zwłaszcza kompletnie pozbawione amunicji.
The insurgent units take up battle positions, but ammunition is scarce. Each man receives but a few rounds. Weapons and ammunition will have to be captured from the enemy.
Wybuch powstania warszawskiego po raz kolejny.
The outbreak of the Warsaw Uprising changed yet again Stalin's view of the Polish situation. He halted the Soviet offensive on the outskirts of Warsaw and thus, de facto, compelled the insurgents to fight a losing battle against the Germans.
Powstanie na tą beznadziejną walkę z siłami niemieckimi. I trzeba powiedzieć, że tutaj
It needs to be said here that Stalin was in a way assisted in his decision by the National People's Council of Bolesław Bierut and Wanda Wasilewska. They said that there was really no uprising in Warsaw. He raised that argument in his discussion with Mikołajczyk, and that really led him to believe that the collapse of the Warsaw Uprising would help him even further in establishing the sort of Poland he wanted.
Ułatwi mu jeszcze bardziej urządzenia Polski według swojej własnej koncepcji.
Crack units like the Panzer Grenadiers are pitted against the insurgents. Command of the German forces in Warsaw is assumed by a veteran of anti-guerrilla operations, General von den Berg-Zaleski. Heavy artillery is pounding the Polish positions.
To była koncepcja Stalina, żeby wykorzystać powstanie.
Stalin grasped that the uprising would really allow him to destroy the living tissue of the nation or the intelligentsia. Such was Stalin's role in sealing the fate of the Warsaw Uprising.
Stalina przy powstaniu warszawskim.
In the first 2 weeks, the Germans lost 5,000 dead and wounded. Hitler was startled at the size of the losses. Battles raged for every street and every house. Hundreds of German soldiers were taken into captivity, but the insurgents had to withdraw gradually to the city center, unable to hold out against overwhelming odds. There was a painful shortage of anti-tank weapons.
Commanding officer of Polish forces called me and he said, probably you will be commanding officer of all Polish fighter squadrons to support Warsaw fighting. And I was so happy. 8 squadrons, I knew that we can smash this Luftwaffe over Warsaw. But Russia didn't give permission to land on the airfields. Even American pilots made few drops over Warsaw, so they landed on the Russian side, and later they didn't give permission anymore. So I knew that everything is finished.
The weapon reinforcements could come only from airdrops. planes with supplies took off from bases in Italy, but lacking a fighter escort, the Allied aircraft became easy prey for the Germans. The supplies were dropped inaccurately and usually fell into German hands. The contact between districts was now possible only through the sewers. Food and water supplies were running out. Civilian losses were mounting steeply. America and Britain could change the decision only insofar as air support was concerned. That is to allow the British and Americans to have bases on Soviet territory from which their planes could attack German troops in Warsaw or airlift supplies to the Warsaw insurgents. I do not believe, however, that there was any realistic possibility of changing Stalin's basic decision. His entire concept of having a whole group of dependent countries west of his borders. Of course, it was even less likely that Stalin would have had second thoughts, as Roosevelt was hesitant. While Churchill attempted many times to press forth the issue of assistance, Roosevelt, of course, did nothing, and that reinforced Stalin in the belief that it was he who was deciding the fate of the war. The Germans were resolved to destroy Warsaw completely. Himmler told the Führer, "Warsaw will be erased, this nation that has blocked our way to the east for the past 700 years and which has been a constant obstruction in our way since the first Battle of Tannenberg. Then, historically, the Polish problem will be no great problem at all, neither to our children nor to all those who will come after us, and not even to us."
We have been fighting with Germans with very little of armament. I myself, till now, I can't understand how could we stay and fight for 60 days with such army.
Who were those home army fighters? Men with fighting experience, but also boys in their teens, a grandfather with a grandson, women, teenage girls. Hunger was taking its toll as well, but faces remained radiant. They knew they would die, but now they were happy because they were free, and the love of freedom was always a trait of the Polish character. Almost a whole generation was to perish here, the cream of Polish youth. In the 63 days of the uprising, 220,000 Poles died in Warsaw, 3 times more than in Hiroshima. The city became one huge graveyard. The Red Army was standing across the Vistula observing the obliteration of the city, in places no more than 600, 700 meters from the scene of the fighting. Stalin was waiting. He did not need those who were fighting the Germans in Warsaw. They were to die. The Western Allies proved unable to prevent the massacre. Among the Allied troops which landed in Normandy, there was also General Maczek's 6th Polish Armored Division. This is its battle trail. The Polish troops liberated Breda and a large part of Holland. 150,000 Polish troops fought on the Western Front. They ended their battle trail in the German town of Wilhelmshaven. The Arnhem Airborne Operation. This ill-conceived landing had been ordered by General Montgomery. The Polish paratroop brigade was decimated in the Market Garden operation.
But the most important Polish contribution towards the win in the Second World War was the breaking of the secret of the German ciphering machine called Enigma. In 1932, 3 Polish cryptanalysts managed to break this secret, and just before the Second World War, in July 1939, Poles disclosed this secret to the French and British delegation in Poland.
The Germans attacked London with their new wonder weapon. First the V1 and then the V2 rockets. The Germans had been developing rockets for a long time. The main designer of this new weapon was Werner von Braun. The testing site. Many of the test launches were unsuccessful. The rockets fell in southern Poland. Intrigued by these flying objects, the Home Army intelligence started to monitor these experiments. They even succeeded in recovering one of the test rockets before the Germans arrived on the scene. After the vital parts were examined by Polish scientists, they were shipped by plane to England. Plans drawn up by the Poles of the testing site and the rocket factory at Świnoujście. This is in fact the birthplace of the American space program. American intelligence services decided to benefit from German missile development brains after the war. Thanks to Polish intelligence, the Allies could plan a bombing raid on the Peenemünde rocket factories. This raid delayed by half a year the firing of the first rockets on London.
It is not always appreciated in the West that there was also an extensive collaboration on military level. For example, there were hundreds of thousands of West Europeans, Danes, Dutch, Norwegians, Belgians, Italians, French, who committed themselves, many wholeheartedly, to the war effort of Nazi Germany. Out of 39 SS divisions, the half were composed of non-Germans, many of them members of West European nations. And they were all volunteers. The Dutch alone had 2 Waffen-SS divisions. 814 Dutchmen died in defense of their own country when it was invaded by the Germans in May 1940. But 10,300 of them were killed in action while fighting against the Red Army on the Eastern Front. The French Waffen-SS division Charlemagne fought with exceptional ferocity in defense of Berlin in April and May 1945, just before the war ended.
The theater of war had now moved into German territory. Two Polish armies were fighting on the Eastern Front, over 200,000 men. Politically, they were subordinated to the pro-communist Polish government in Lublin. The Second Polish Army fought on the southern section of the Soviet advance near Dresden. It suffered heavy losses in battles with panzer units on their way to reinforce the troops defending Berlin. The Polish armed forces were the 4th largest in the wartime anti-Nazi coalition, much larger in size than the French. The 1st Polish Thaddeus Kościuszko Division fought heavy battles for Berlin. It distinguished itself in capturing Tiergarten Station. On May 9, 1945, Field Marshal Keitel signed the ratification documents of the Act of Unconditional Surrender. But for Poland and other Central European countries, the political consequences of the Soviet-German alliance of 1939 were to continue for a further 45 years. In Potsdam, Stalin dictated the proceedings. Here, the official seal was placed on all that had been agreed in secret diplomatic exchanges among the big powers.
The fate of the Polish underground resistance movement is one of the saddest and most tragic stories of the Second World War. Poland had been occupied from the first day of the war in September 1939 to the last, and throughout that time, perhaps the biggest and best organized of the European resistance movements struggled against the Nazi occupation. And yet at the end of the war, the Polish resistance movement, which was one of our most courageous allies, was suppressed not by the Nazis, but by our other allies, the Soviets. Of course, a great tragedy occurred in Warsaw during the Warsaw Rising of 1944, when the underground resistance had tried to attack the Germans with armed force and were suppressed with the loss of 250,000 lives. And the failure of the Warsaw Rising struck a mortal blow to the underground. But nonetheless, the final chapter of the resistance movement was that it was rounded up and in large measure killed by our Soviet allies. In March 1945, the 16 political leaders of the Polish underground, representing all the political movements from the socialists on one side to the Catholic Party and the nationalists on the other side, came out of hiding on the guarantee of a safe pass from the Soviet commander, only to be arrested and to be sent to Moscow for trial, where they were sentenced to heavy punishments, if one can believe it, for illegal activities. That episode, I think, is one of the most obscene events at the end of the war, and the fact that the British and American ambassadors in Moscow assisted at the trial and didn't protest is a matter for our own very great shame.
The Prime Minister of the emigre London government, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, arrived in Poland. Mikołajczyk's arrival was an attempt at forming a government of national unity. 2 years later, he was compelled to flee the country in the boot of the American ambassador's car. By that time, the totalitarian Soviet-installed regime of Bolesław Bierut had openly revealed its true face. Former Home Army soldiers were being arrested and shot. The Soviet secret police chose those to be branded as enemies of the people.
In the first part of the war, Poles were inspired. President Roosevelt publicly stated Poland is the inspiration of the world. Churchill, after defeat by France, received General Sikorski in London saying, "We shall win together or we shall perish together." Poles did not realize during the war Poland was not a subject of the Allied policy. Poland was an object of the policy of the great powers. This means the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. For them, Poland was a marginal issue. For Stalin, however, expansion in Central Eastern Europe was of primary importance. This was tragedy of Poland and other Eastern European countries.
General Dwight Eisenhower saw many cities destroyed in Europe. He also saw Warsaw on a brief official visit shortly after VE Day. Faced with the enormity of destruction, he reacted very emotionally, saying, "The war had not justified this. I would like every American soldier to see this city and to tell others about it." That wish of the future US president was not fulfilled, and not much was said in the West about the extent of Poland's destruction, neither of the Polish military effort in that war. Perhaps it was better to forget it, to put to peace one's own mind. But that shroud of silence made many Poles in the United States and Western Europe bitter.
I have to tell that I am in the United States right now, 34 years, over 34 years, all the time in Washington, D.C. And what I observed is complete neglect of Polish war effort. One must to remember that altogether Polish war effort, including Polish underground, Polish political underground, which was as well war effort. Then you see Polish army in Poland in campaign 1939, Polish army in France, and then in Great Britain, in Italy, in Middle East, in Northern Africa. You know what is the general number of Poles who came that way? Nearly 3 million people altogether. And you know how large was British army? In 1945, at the end of the war, 3 million people. Was our war effort and our suffering altogether. How many people died, for instance, in Warsaw itself? 800,000. What was losses of the United States altogether? 450,000 people. This is what it was. And in Warsaw only, not saying anything about any other part of the country, in Warsaw only, 800,000 during the war. This was our war effort. And altogether in Poland, over 6 million people killed by Germans. And how many were killed by Russians? How many were sent to Russia, to concentration, to lagers, so-called concentration camps and so on? Our war effort is neglected, but it was for such country enormous, improbably enormous. And we have to remember that. And remember how we fought, for instance, in Italy. Polish forces took Monte Cassino. Polish forces took Ancona. Polish forces took Bologna. This is what it happened. We, for instance, we liberated part of Belgium, part of Netherlands. We fought there everywhere. We fought for Falaise, for instance, the most important probably battle in France in 1944. This is what it was. And then the Warsaw Uprising. It was the greatest battle from the underground, from the beginning was underground. Greatest battle in one city in modern history.
The people of Łomianki near Warsaw did not forget the brave crew of an American super fortress who died coming to the assistance of the Warsaw Uprising. Since the war, we have had several other holocausts on ideological grounds. The 20th century is the age of ideology. And if it is the age of ideology, then people are killed in its name. So it was many times after the war. My wish is that those who see this picture become aware that life is the greatest human value, and that thousands of human lives cannot be laid at the altar of ideals and ideology. symbolic grave of Polish officers murdered at Katyn. No one knows exactly how many Poles died in Russia. Historians give the figure of around 700,000. Poland had the misfortune of having found itself in between two states affected by ideological insanity: fascist Germany and Stalin's communist Russia. Their only achievement were graves upon graves. These cemeteries could never be forgotten. They must become a symbol of eternal vigilance.